Hey everyone, thanks for coming. If you weren't here a couple minutes ago, I think we're going to wait until, I don't know, about 4:02 to get started, just to make sure that everyone who has registered is able to join us. This is being recorded. Actually, we're being live streamed. So if you happen to need to duck out partway through, you can always go back and access the recording on our YouTube channel. That link will also be shared with everyone who's registered for this event after the event is over. So don't worry about it. We will make sure you get all of the content. Okay, I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. I'm Lindsay Rank. I'm FIRE's Student Press Council, so I run our Student Press Freedom Initiative. But you don't have to listen to me talk today because my great colleague Anne Marie Tamburro is going to be talking to you about FOIA and public records and giving you sort of the down low on how to do public records requests, what you can do with public records requests, etc. I do really want to quickly just plug some of the programs that the Student Press Freedom Initiative, which we like to call SPIFFY, has to offer. If you go to studentpress.thefire.org, there's a whole list of our programming, including our 24/7 hotline, which you can call and reach me or Anne Marie or one of our other colleagues day or night with your legal questions. We also have a great website called canipublishthis.com, which helps you to look at your content critically for any legal risks that might be present. It's sort of like a TurboTax or a BuzzFeed quiz for your legal questions. But again, I just really want to give it away to Anne Marie, who's going to give you some great information today about FOIA and public records. So thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Anne Marie now.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like Lindsay said, my name is Anne Marie. I am a program officer in FIRE's Individual Rights Defense Program, and I also work on some of SPIFFY's different projects. So before I was a lawyer and before I was working at FIRE, I too was a student journalist. And following being a student journalist, I also worked at a law firm during my time in law school where we specialized in FOIA and public records law. So this is an area of the law that is very near and dear to me. I would consider myself a bit of a FOIA nerd, as the folks like to say. So hopefully today is the day that you find yourself a FOIA nerd as well, or you begin your process into becoming one. So yes, this presentation is designed to be an understanding of the basics on how you can use FOIA and public records to improve your reporting and, what this process looks like. So let's get into it. So if you're not familiar, you're probably wondering, what the heck is FOIA? Why is it important? Why do we care about it? So FOIA is used generally to refer to the body of law that guarantees your right to information held by government agencies. FOIA specifically is an acronym that stands for the Freedom of Information Act, which is a federal law that guarantees access to information from federal agencies, but it's used more loosely to refer to this area of law outside of federal laws. And It has several other different names. So you might hear FOIA, you might hear FOIL, which is Freedom of Information Law. You might hear public records, open records, access to information. All of these are talking about the same thing, which is, this law that guarantees your right to request information from the government. And in turn, this information that you request is provided to you as records which memorialize public business. So why does the public care about this? Why does this exist? And the bottom line for that is that it's going to ensure government transparency and promote accountability. So this gives the public an eye into what's going on in the offices of the state. How are things operating? So in turn, that lets citizens better participate in democracy. Journalists like you request information from the government and then publicize it. And then the public will take that information with them into the ballot box to make informed decisions when voting. Access to this information also allows for a check on things like corruption or, inefficiency. If we can see what workers are doing, we can see, are they doing something bad? Or, maybe they are just kind of bad at their job. And this in turn, again, can influence voters and also, contribute to public backlash, say when something is going wrong or improper. This information also can be used to reflect how taxpayer money is being used. So what are the employees that taxpayers' money is, funding their salary? What are they doing? How are government programs operating? You can use these records as receipts in a sense to see, the ways that your money is contributing to the operation of the government. So, who does this area of the law affect? So, like I mentioned, FOIA specifically is a federal law, and it applies to agencies of the executive branch of the federal government. So, this list includes dozens of agencies. It's very long. You can find it on FOIA.gov. But to name a few, this includes the DOJ, the CIA, FTC, USPS, etc. It goes on and on. Again, find the full list on their website. However, I will note that FOIA does not apply to the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, or their personal staff. Additionally, open records laws is another area of this law which applies to state and local government bodies and government agencies. So that again sounds pretty broad. So some examples would be, city and county governments and their public officials, public universities, public university administrators, and public university student governments. Unfortunately, not private universities, but all of these for public universities. And additionally, you can use this law to get information from police departments or government contractors where, there's a private company being paid to perform activities for the state and paid by the state. So, when considering who this is going to affect, you can be a little bit creative and think about, is this entity acting on behalf of the state? Is it receiving state money and doing a state function? Sometimes that answer is going to be really obvious, if it's like a city government, but, it can be a little bit less or more removed for things like government contractors. So this, the application of this law is pretty broad, which makes it really useful for reporters to get information about what's going on in, either, your local area or national news. So moving on, how can you use this area of the law to aid in your reporting? So this can be used to help you improve existing stories, things you're already working on. When you're working on a story, you might want to take a moment to ask, is there a way you can use a record to verify or explore a little bit more deeply what information the source is telling you or, already public available information. So say you interview a government source and they give you a rundown of, their take on what's going on. You could ask for, records of their emails or internal government memos, things like that, that might tell a little bit of a different story. So you can essentially use this as a way to fact check the information you're receiving from government sources. Furthermore, using these records in your reporting is going to add credibility. It's going to show that you took an approach from every single angle to find out information about the issues you're reporting on and explored it fully. So when you're getting this information, it can serve you by adding different facts and figures to incorporate in your reporting as well. So this can come from, the substance or the information specifically that you're asking for. So you can ask for things like budgets, dates, timelines, big numbers. Say, for example, you're working on a story about a new park that's being developed in your city. So records could tell you things like, when did the development project start? How much did the city pay for the land that the park's being built on? How long is the project going to take? Who's being contracted to complete the labor? How much are they being paid? So very kind of discrete factual information that maybe you didn't get out of your interviews with your sources. Maybe you missed, maybe they just didn't tell you, or maybe you want to confirm it. Additionally, you can look at the records you receive from these requests a little bit more abstractly and use, the response to the records as a data point itself. So thinking this way, you might consider, how voluminous was the request you received? Say you were expecting to get a ton of records back and you only got a little, or, maybe the converse. You can also consider things like how frequently different terms or people or agencies came up within the specific records. So there's ways to use both the information in the records and then what the response itself looked like to incorporate different kinds of facts and numbers into your reporting. Beyond improving existing stories, records can also help you come up with new stories. So, if you're looking for story ideas, you might start with an existing idea that isn't fully developed yet. Maybe you're waiting on some new information or some kind of newsworthy hook. It's something you're curious or interested in, but it hasn't quite gotten there. Maybe try to consider how records could take it to that next step and make it something that's worth reporting on and answer some kinds of questions or concerns that's coming up within the public. So I should note that if you can get ahead of a story or a controversy with your records requests, you're likely going to have better luck getting information that's juicy or, maybe not quite so flattering to the entity you're requesting it from, because the earlier you are, the less notice they're going to have that you're submitting your request. And, if something isn't already being, broadcasted, they're going to be less incentivized to want to get ahead of the information getting out. So let's consider some different ideas more specifically on how you could use these requests to come up with story ideas. So one way is to look for, let's use the public university as context. You might see big administrative decisions coming out about, budgets or hiring decisions, shifts in university leadership, stuff that, the general reporting on it might be relatively basic, but public records might be able to give you a different angle, and that they're going to give you the opportunity to look for insight on these decisions. What were the internal conversations looking like between administrators that contributed to these big decisions? Was there any kind of internal controversy? How long did things take? So, these are the kinds of deeper questions that might not be answered in really superficial reporting on these kinds of big news that you could look to tackle with public records requests. Another idea, this one comes up a lot with journalists who like using public records in their work, is that you can also ask for logs of existing records requests. So for example, you could ask your university for a log of all records requests that have been submitted over the past, 3 months. So this is a great way to find out what information do other people want to know? What's anybody else curious about? And it also informs, maybe future requests you might want to submit too. You can get ideas from this. And knowing these records requests have already been submitted and processed, then Great. That means if you're interested, you can submit the same exact ones. And lastly, this was a very specific idea from one of my coworkers. You can use public records requests to get the emails between your university president and sitting politicians. So that one is a little bit more specific than the others, but it might be an interesting peek at the different kind of political motivations or influence that is affecting university business. And you can kind of translate that idea of looking for insight on otherwise, current affairs or superficial news to find ways that you can be creative with public records to come up with news stories. I should highlight that, you don't need a specific reason to file a request. You can just do it for any reason whatsoever. Granted, you don't want to be, annoying and file a ton of really burdensome requests and bother your public officials over and over again about them. That might get in the way with future requests, but still, I would encourage you to exercise your right liberally because it's just kind of fun to be nosy and it's a great way to find stories. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions. I don't know that you can speak into the mic, so please submit your questions in the chat. Also, I don't know if I'm going to see them, so if either Lindsay or Sabrina could tell me if there's any questions, please let me know.
I'm keeping an eye out. There's no questions yet, but yeah, folks should feel totally free to pop them into the chat.
Yes. So again, I will have points for questions. If you have any in the meantime, yeah, please just send them in the chat and somebody will give me a heads up. I also want to let you know that I will be sending my slides after this in the event you want to use them.
Anne Marie, there's a question here. Are personnel files included in open records laws?
So I would say, I think you could probably find redacted versions of these. Some personal information in these records is likely not going to be included. Like you're not going to be able to get employees like, social security numbers, obviously, or like, health information. But I think you would generally be able to get some of this information.
A lot of it depends on state law too.
Yes.
So it sort of depends on what state you're in. Some states make a pretty broad exception for personnel records. Other states have much narrower exceptions that only accept certain personnel records, sort of like what Anne Marie was saying. So if you're looking to request certain personnel records, feel free to call the SPIFFY hotline or submit a case on our website, and we'd be happy to help walk you through the law applicable in your state to figure out how that might work.
Yes, I'll say this again throughout this presentation, but just to get it in your heads, if you have any issues or concerns when you're going through this process, please reach out to SPIFFY and we would be happy to help. Okay, so I'm going to move on. All right, so now you're at the point where you might want to consider filing your request. Isn't that exciting? So I'm going to walk you through some of the steps now that you're familiar with, why this area of the law is important, maybe some ideas about what you can do with it. So let's start with step one. So you're going to want to consider what information you're interested in. This is kind of an obvious one, but you need to know what information you want before you submit the request. So how do you decide what information you're interested in? You might want to think about what questions public records could answer in your reporting and, what kinds of documents or information might be able to provide those answers. This is the step where you're going to want to start getting familiar with your state and local laws. So Lindsay hinted at this with her answer to the previous question, but states are going to have a lot of different exemptions and limitations on the kinds of information they're allowed to release. So I will say, you can get a lot of information. It's going to surprise you, some of the things you can find that you're entitled access to, but there still will be limitations. Like I mentioned earlier, you're generally not going to be able to get highly personal information, such as people's, identifying information like social security numbers or driver's license numbers. You're not going to be able to get, health records or, educational records, things that are just highly personal are generally out of bounds. And, beyond that, each state or municipality is going to have its own very particularized limitations and exemptions beyond that. So it's, don't let that discourage you. I promise there's a lot of information out there, but it's a good idea to get ahead of these exemptions and, learn them so that you can, consider them when you're trying to come up with your ideas, and don't, get really excited about the possibility of getting something only to find out that it's exempt. And also being familiar with your exemptions is going to save you from having your requests rejected later on in the process. Okay, so step 2, identify who has the record and who the public custodian for, or who the public records custodian is for that record. So this, let's see, there may be several different entities or offices who have the information you're interested in. You might not know, and it's perfectly okay to submit multiple records requests to different offices. This really shouldn't be a problem as long as you're not sending, a bunch of redundant requests to the same office. If you're not sure who has something, you might as well try several different places. So once you've kind of identified the offices you want to send it to, now it's time to look for the public records custodian. And who is the public records custodian? That is just the person who is charged with maintaining public records requests, responding to them, fulfilling them, finding all the information and organizing it. Sometimes entities will have one specific person tasked with this. Sometimes it'll be several people. Usually you can figure out who this is pretty easily. You're just gonna want to Google, the name of whatever entity you're interested in, and then something like public records, open records, or right to know. So an example might be University of Florida public records, or City of Philadelphia open records. Something simple like that will usually lead you to the place where you're going to submit your request, whether it's an individual public records custodian, an email address, or some kind of form submission. In the event that you can't find that information online, then you should just go ahead and call the administrative personnel for whatever the source of the information you're looking is. They'll be able to identify it, whether that's like the administrative offices of a particular government agency or your university's registrar's office. Somebody out there knows who you need to ask to get this information. So usually it's relatively simple to find it, but in the event that you can't, just go ahead, give a phone call, and somebody is going to have that information for you. And so now we move on to step 3. Now that you know what information you want, you have an idea of that, you're able to get it, you're not going to run into any exemptions, and also where you're going to send your request to, it's time to draft it. So this is definitely the tricky part of this process. If, reading law and doing research isn't already a little bit tricky on its own. The hard thing about this is kind of finding that sweet spot between submitting a request that is really specific and submitting a request that is really broad. So there's different kinds of issues you can run into with, falling on the extreme side of either end of the spectrum. So if your records request is too broad, flat out, it might get rejected, or you maybe have to amend it. This isn't the end of the world. You can easily just submit another request, but bureaucracy can be a little bit slow, and this is just kind of inconvenient. So it's easier if you can get ahead of it and avoid having, your reporting delayed, and limit the amount of time between you and the information you want getting to you. Additionally, filing a too broad of a request raises the concerns of the price. So sometimes having a really voluminous request that requires a lot of manpower, a lot of hours and labor to fulfill can come with a slightly higher price tag. I should note that records are not always going to be expensive. Certain states, it's not going to cost you anything to have your request fulfilled. Other states will have waivers specifically for journalists, so you can avoid being charged where otherwise you might be. So, not always going to be expensive, just something to keep in mind. Again, another area where you're going to want to be more familiar with your state's laws, so you have an idea of what the price tag is going to look like, and consider that with your budget before you file a request that maybe is going to require a lot of effort to produce. And also, again, if you have any problems with the fees, please contact SPIFFY. Sometimes custodians are going to charge you a really exorbitant price tag because they are just trying to get between you getting the information you need, and they're using that as another barrier. So if that comes up, please reach out to us and we will be happy to help you there. So lastly, as a practical matter, if your records request is too broad and you get a lot of information back, you're just going to have to put a lot of work into looking through all the documents and actually finding the things that are relevant to you. So it's much easier to save yourself time and effort on the early end of this process rather than having it come back and bite you once you have way too much information and more than you know what to do with or that you need. So in turn, what happens when your request is too narrow? This is really basic. You're just not going to get the information you want and you're going to have to file again. Like I said, filing another request, not the end of the world. You're going to have to do it at some point. But if you can take the steps to avoid it earlier on, then you're going to be in a much better position. So now that I've talked to you about this process in the abstract, I would like to walk you through some more particular examples. As I'm sure all of you are aware, FIRE's work concerns civil liberties in the context of higher education. So we submit a lot of public records requests to public universities and also some, like this one I'm about to show you, to police departments. So for some context on this particular request, like it says up here at the top of the slide, this is a narrow request. We had an idea of a very kind of particularized piece of information we were looking for, and we knew we could get it. This particular case was a situation where we heard of reports of students who were arrested for property damage charges because they posted some flyers criticizing an administrator on campus buildings. So we didn't have a lot of information about the property damage that occurred, so we wanted to know more. Was there actually property damage that somebody had to clean up, or was that just, an excuse to have these students charged for publicly criticizing a university administrator? So the records we were looking for were specifically a work log that detailed what campus building services had to do to clean up the alleged property damage. So they had to actually do something to clean up the property damage, then that would suggest there was actually property damage and this wasn't, just an excuse. So let's take a moment to look at the specific wording in this request. So going down to point number 1, which starts off with any document, record, or information detailing work. So like I said, we were looking for work logs. However, we don't really know what work logs look like. We didn't know, maybe there was not a specific file that just said work logs. Maybe it was a conglomeration of different documents that would reflect what you might assume a work log would provide. So by referring to this information and asking for something a little bit more vaguely, document, record, information, that's a lot broader than work log, we're making sure that we're still going to get this information and, not missing the point by straight up calling it a work log. So looking at the next portion of number 1, performed by Purdue University Building Service in response to a report of property damage. So here, or actually, let's look more at the whole rest of this. So work performed by building services in response to a report of property damage sent by the police department on November 6, 2021. So this is definitely the more narrowing part of the request as opposed to the very broad words that started off. We're looking for work performed by a very particular university department. We don't care what other university departments are doing. We know that this is the department that's going to be responding to property damage, cleaning up this sort of thing. It won't be any other department, no unrelated academic or administrative things, just building services. The next part, in response to a report of property damage sent by the police department, we're only looking for building services performed in response to this particular incident. So we don't care about, any other incidents that might have happened that day or that week. We don't care about, routine maintenance that the building services were doing, just this particularized report of property damage. And then let's see here, on November 6th, 2021. So we had an idea of maybe like what time of day they performed these duties. So, but not an exact time. So we don't need to put a specific time. Putting the day is like perfectly narrow here because we know that the building services were performed that specific day. So it doesn't need to be any broader or any more narrow than it already is. So now looking at portion 2 of the request, any document or public record otherwise relating to the university's response to the distribution of flyers reading wanted Brandon Cutler. So this is basically going to get us the same information as the first piece here, but it's going to save our backs in the event that something we wrote in point 1 was off, or if we missed something, or we're missing some kind of piece to this puzzle. So, not that much more broad than we needed to go. Again, just serving as kind of a catch-all in the event that we skipped out on something. So this request worked. We got the work logs. It was great. So this is just a way to show you there can be instances where you can request something very, very specific. There's definitely kind of a measured way to do it so that you're giving yourself a little bit of slack in the event that, maybe you're slightly off with your understanding of the particularized medium this information is stored in, but you're still going to, point for this very specific thing that exists. Okay, so I see a question here from YouTube. I'm gonna pause and respond to it. So the question was asking the difference in public versus private school. Yes, so FOIA and open records laws are only going to apply to public universities because those are state actors. So private universities, unfortunately, you cannot use these laws to get information from. You can get information from, police departments or, maybe other government entities who have some kind of interaction with the private university, but you're not going to be able to get records from the university's administrators or student governments. That's off limits with private universities, unfortunately. Okay, did that answer your question? I'm gonna assume so.
It's probably important to note though, that just even if you're at a private institution, you can sometimes get records from public agencies in the community that might have to do with your university. So for example, if a crime occurred on campus and local police were called, you still might be able to get local police records related to that crime that occurred on campus by requesting them from the local police department.
Yes, thank you. So there is a little bit of like a workaround to get records that kind of, touch the university a little bit, but yeah, you're not going to be able to get them from the university itself. So I'm going to move on to my next example, which is something more broad. So you can tell this is more broad just on its face because there's a lot more text here. So for context on why we wanted this record, this was for a case concerning a controversial speaker at SUNY Brockport, where the university rescinded grant funding for the speaker and also moved the speaking event online following public backlash. Justification the university gave for these decisions was, pretty superficial. They mentioned some kind of like non-compliance with internal processes and new information contributing to the rescinding of grant funding. And they also mentioned security concerns for the need to move the event online. That's really pretty vague. So we wanted to know a bit more about what really was motivating this decision? What did those internal conversations look like? And what kind of information was the university working with to inform this particular decision? So I'll break down each piece of this record, starting with number one, which is where we requested administrators' communications. I'm going to note that communications between public employees is a really valuable way to get information. You know, this is something that comes up again and again. It's just very interesting to see how public employees are communicating with each other, what they're talking about. It's a great way to find insight on how certain public issues are being handled. So I'm going to walk you through each piece of this part of the record and why we included the words that we did. So starting with number one, any internal or external communications, followed by this long parenthetical list. So like I said, we wanted communications, and we all can understand that communications is broad. It's not, conversations aren't just happening over email or phone call. Maybe there's other different kinds of mediums where these conversations and discussions are taking place. So we wanted to cast a wide net here to include all different kinds of mediums to make sure we weren't going to miss out on something just because, you know, we failed to put in text messages. So this is a situation where it's acceptable to cast a wide net and be a little bit more generous with your wording. So following this list, the request says sent or received by the names of several administrators. So based on our research, these were people who we figured would be likely to have information about these decisions or to have been participating in the conversations about these decisions, whether it because of their role or because of their, you know, mentioning in public reporting or university statements about the event. We had an idea that these were the people who were talking about what was going on. So it's acceptable, again, to have this longer list of names because we didn't know exactly who was talking to. Maybe it wasn't one or two people. In the event that, you know, maybe one or two of these people weren't participating in conversations, that's okay. We might as well just include them to be safe as long as you're not being excessive. So you can see we didn't ask for the communications of like an entire university department. Maybe there are certain circumstances where that might be useful or appropriate, but not the case here, since that would get us a lot of information or require people to look through a lot of information that's just not going to be relevant. So this list of names was the nice measured approach we took. And moving on to the next part of section one, which is from March 14th to the present date. So let's see. This again was a nice comfortable window of time where we assumed these conversations were going to be taking place based on the reporting of the event. You know, we didn't know exactly what specific day they were happening, but you know, this was a nice reasonable window to ensure we were going to get the conversations and emails that we wanted without going way too far back in time or, you know, being overly generous with our assumption of when they were going to happen. And now we can look at this last portion of the request. So these communications, which include any of the following keywords or relate to the speaking appearance of Jalil Montekim. So Jalil Montekim was the speaker. Of course, we're going to look for records that have his last name in it. We're also going to ask for records with the name Anthony Bottom in it, because that was an alternate name that the speaker used at a different time of his life. So we don't want to miss out on records just because they're using an older name for him. This guy was also referred to as a political prisoner. So maybe there would be conversations where administrators were talking about that particular aspect of him and the event instead of, you know, just mentioning his name. So we don't want to miss out on those either. And lastly, police. So as I mentioned previously, the university disclosed that there were security concerns to justify moving the event online. So it makes sense for us to include conversations where the police are going to be mentioned relating to this event, so we can try to better understand what the security concerns are and how, you know, they're relating to law enforcement. So that is a good idea of what records requesting communications might look like. I think with communications, you're definitely going to be a little bit more broad with your terms, just because people talk about stuff in unpredictable ways, and you're better safe than sorry, where if you have a specific document in mind, it's much easier to ask for something where it exists, whereas conversations are much more fleeting. Let's see, I see something in the chat. I'm just gonna see. Okay. Another question from the panelists before I move on, or another question for the panelists before I move on. So, will FIRE provide any assistance in writing a FOIA, or perhaps offer a referral? So I will get to this later on at the end of this presentation. I have some very helpful resources for you guys, some links to websites that can provide you forms basically to submit these requests, or not submit them, but to draft them and make it really easy for you once you know what information you want and where you're going to send it to. So the forms will help you plug in, you put in the information and then it'll plug in all of the boilerplate language needed to make sure it's going to, not immediately get tossed out. In addition to that, if you run into any problems or want advice when drafting these requests, FIRE is happy to help you. Please reach out to SPIFFY and we can walk you through whatever the specific information you're looking for is, and what that letter might look like.
We should mention though that that's a service. We do help with drafting these, but that's a service we only provide to student journalists. So if you were a college journalist and you would like some help drafting a FOIA request, please reach out to us. If you're a student or faculty member, we may also be able to help you. But student journalists, for sure, we are able to help with that drafting process.
Okay, so let's now take a look at the other portions of this request, 2, 3, and 4. These are a lot less detailed than the request for communications. So let's start with number 2, which we asked for any feedback received by the university concerning the speaking event. This is, pretty simple. We heard this event was being, changed because of public backlash and, public input and feedback. The university said this themselves. So we wanted to know what information were they working with to make this particular decision. Now looking at number 3, and I'm going to lump this one together with number 4. So we asked for, in 3, any records that form the basis for the president's statement about security concerns prompting the event to be moved online. And number 4, any records forming the basis for the grant being withdrawn, and mentioning that new information that was brought up in the statement that the university released and influenced this decision. So looking at these 2 portions of the request, you can see that they both kind of start off the same. Any records which form the basis for. So you might be thinking to yourself, any records forming the basis for sounds pretty broad. However, the latter portion of both of these requests is going to measure out how broad the starting portion is. So, we go into very specific details about what we want these records to show us. We're not looking for anything that isn't going to show us, the basis for either of these decisions. So, while any records is going to allow us the leeway to get records in any kind of medium that, maybe we know or we don't know of, whether it's, memos or notes or other communications, records is going to catch all. But again, these are going to be really specific and only refer to, information that helped form the basis for these specific decisions. So some takeaways from this request here. You can see kind of like the, relationship between portions of your request that are going to come off as really broad, and then portions that are going to come off as being very narrow and particularized to the information that you're interested in getting. And so, considering that balance and working narrow parts in where they're useful to you and broad parts in where they're also useful to you is going to make you more effective at submitting these requests and getting records that are actually relevant to the information you're looking for. Another note about this request is that it's acceptable to ask for several different kinds of records or information in a single request. So this is going to take you back to considering what office you're asking the information from. Like for this, we just submitted a general form request to the university's public records officer. It wasn't broken down by any particular department. Sometimes that's just going to be how it is, depending on, what office you're referring to. It's not going to have individual point people. So considering they gave us a general contact, it was appropriate for us to send them several very different requests for information. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that you can be generous with the things or the types of information you're looking for within the umbrella of a single request. So I'll take a moment now to answer any questions you guys might have at this point. Okay, I'm not seeing any. I'll try to keep an eye out for that notification box in the event that it pops up. But at this point, I'm going to point you towards some wonderful resources. I think I mentioned that I'm going to share my slides with you at the end of this, so you'll have all these links. There's no need to rush and write them all down. But, these resources start off with some guides on open records laws. I mentioned over and over again, you want to be familiar with the law. And looking to the law is really going to answer pretty much any question you have, unless it's really, really granular. So the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has two wonderful resources for you in order to do this. The first one is the Open Government Guide, which is a giant compilation of information about every single state's different public records laws. It's immensely useful, and it's going to be really helpful to get very particularized information concerning where you live with. So a great place to start if you're trying to learn more about the laws that apply to your specific state. They also have the FOIA Wiki, which is a similar resource, but just for FOIA and for federal open records laws. Additionally, the other two resources I have listed here are the letter generators that I was talking about earlier. So the SPLC has a letter generator for state and local public records requests. So like I mentioned, you'll put in some very basic personal information just so that, the government knows where to send your request. You'll put in the information you want, the address and individual you're sending it to, and the letter generator will plug in all of the other language you need to make sure you're covered. It'll reference all of the appropriate laws in your jurisdiction. You might want to double check it if you're asking for something really specific and unusual, but for the most part, it'll take care of the heavy lifting for you. And then it'll spit out a nice letter for you once you've filled out the form, and then you can send that to the appropriate public records custodian. The Reporters Committee also has a letter generator and actually request management system for FOIA federal requests. So it'll help you generate a letter, it'll help you figure out where to send it, and it'll also provide you a platform to manage any communications you're getting in terms of receiving the records. So very useful. And that is all the information I have from you. If anybody has any final questions, please submit them now. I see there's one in the chat.
Yep, it's from YouTube.
Okay, regarding public funding for private universities, what opportunity does that create for access to information? I'm actually not sure how to answer this question. I think even for universities who are receiving, like federal aid money, but they're private universities, I think you still can't get the records. Lindsay, can you confirm?
Well, you can get records from public agencies that are providing the money. So you might be able to get records from like the Department of Education that have to do with that institution. There are other agencies that may also have records related to that institution, related to, various funding mechanisms, grants, those kinds of things. Like if someone at a private university is receiving a a government grant for research, you should be able to get records from that government agency about that research and the grant application, for example, obviously subject to exceptions that may exist. But there certainly are some opportunities when you have a government agency working alongside a private institution.
Great, thank you. So yeah, look for the public agencies and point your records requests at them rather than the private university. Okay, another question. So what steps are taken should a request be denied? So this is going to depend on what the specific denial looks like. Generally speaking, if your records request is denied, the records custodian should tell you why. They're going to say something like it's too broad, it's overly burdensome. They're going to list specific exemptions. And at that point, you'll know how to adjust your request, take out any information or, requests for specific information that maybe you shouldn't have put in there, and then send it back to them and have them, review it again. If they're not telling you why they denied the request, well, they need to do that. So ask them. And in the event that they continue to deny telling you, you should come talk to SPIFFY because we'll be able to help out at that point. And, we'll be able to help out even, if you have questions about why a certain exemption was brought up or why they said, why they justified the denial. But generally speaking, yeah, they'll be able to tell you why it was denied, and then you'll be able to adjust the request accordingly.
And sometimes the reasons for denial are, for lack of a better word, BS. I mean, we run into that all the time in our records requests at FIRE. And so sometimes it is worth pursuing an appeal, for example, which the way that you appeal a denial of a public records request really depends on what state you're in. So if you get a denial with a reason that you just think is, BS, ludicrous, doesn't really apply, please reach out to SPIFFY. We can help walk you through what the appeal process might look like or connect you with an attorney. We even sometimes litigate these cases. We have one right now against Charleston State University, a lawsuit where we're suing because they denied a public records request. So yeah, please reach out if you are dealing with that kind of a denial. Sorry, one more thing. Also, if they're delaying, delay can be a constructive denial. So if it's just been forever, please also call their statute. They're usually statutory limits on how long they can take to give you records. And so if they're just taking a really long time, sometimes we can treat that as a denial and pursue an appeal or other means.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, I'm not hearing any, but if another one comes in while I'm talking, that's fine. I would just like to end this and encourage you all to go out and, request to your heart's content. The worst that any, public employee is going to do is just tell you no. So you might as well get going and get some practice in and try to understand how this works. And, eventually you'll get a feel for it and be able to use it in really helpful ways. So, please turn to SPIFFY if you have any problems in this process, or if you ever have, any questions about this. We're happy to help and talk you through whatever issues you have. And additionally, I would like to remind you all of our other lovely resources available to student journalists. So we have a 24-hour hotline, like Lindsay mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Call us anytime, day or night. You're going to be talking to, very likely one of us. We'll be excited to hear what's going on, or maybe not excited if you're dealing with an issue, but either way, we're happy to help. And if it's something less pressing, please reach out to us at thefire.org/alarm, which is our online case submission form. Another reminder about canipublishthis.com, which is going to provide you an interactive guide on common media law issues. Really fun and easy to walk through. You don't actually have to talk to a person if you don't feel like doing that, but that'll probably be your next steps if it leads you down a certain path. But very fun to play with and get familiar with media law issues. And lastly, I would encourage you to stay in touch, keep up to date with what's going on with FIRE and SPIFFY, because we will have more webinars and trainings and conferences to come in the future. So thank you all so much for attending.